The ballroom shimmered, not just with the reflection of 1,000 crystal chandeliers, but with the concentrated power of New York's elite. CEOs, politicians, media moguls, the kind of people who could shift markets with a phone call and topple governments with a whisper, all gathered to celebrate my engagement to Sophia Langley. My fiancée, or so they thought. Champagne flowed like water, the clinking of glasses a constant symphony of celebration. Waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of canapés that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The air crackled with that unique blend of ambition and envy that only obscene wealth can generate. I worked the room, a practiced smile on my face, my hand outstretched in greeting. "Senator, good to see you." "And Mr. Murdoch, congratulations on the merger." "Miss Wintour, you look radiant." The words were rote, the gestures automatic, but the effect was undeniable. I was Damien Carter, and in this room, I was king. Sophia was by my side, a vision in emerald green, her smile as dazzling as the diamonds on her finger, a rather substantial rock I'd selected myself. She played the role of the supportive fiancée to perfection, her laughter echoing a little too loudly, her touch lingering a little too long on the arms of the various important men she encountered. I watched her, of course. I watched everything. The subtle shift in her gaze when Elliot Blackwell entered the room, the way her smile tightened when he approached us, the almost imperceptible tremor in her voice when she greeted him. "Elliot," I said, my voice smooth, my smile unwavering. "Good of you to come." Blackwell, the venture capitalist du jour, all sharp angles and expensive suits, oozed that desperate charm of a man trying to climb the ladder. He'd been circling me for months, sniffing around for an investment, a connection, a lifeline. He was a parasite, clinging to the coattails of those with real power. And tonight, he was using Sophia as his in. "Damien," he said, his grin a little too wide, his eyes a little too eager. "Congratulations, Sophia. You look stunning." Sophia's smile widened, her gaze lingering on Blackwell a moment too long. "Thank you, Elliot," she purred. "You're looking quite successful yourself." The undercurrent was there, a subtle tension, a shift in the air. I could feel it, and I knew something was about to happen. The speeches began. The usual platitudes, the toast to love and happiness, the veiled references to power and influence. I played my part, my smile unwavering, my words carefully chosen. But my attention was on Sophia, on her growing unease, her covert glances towards Blackwell, the way her fingers fidgeted with the ring on her finger. And then it happened. As the applause for my father's speech died down, Sophia stepped forward. The room fell silent. All eyes were on her. "Damien," she began, her voice trembling slightly, I need to say something." I raised an eyebrow, my smile tightening. "Of course, darling," I said, my voice smooth, controlled. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her gaze flickering towards Blackwell, then back to me. I can't do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath, a ripple of shock that spread through the assembled guests. "Can't do what, darling?" I asked, my voice still calm, still controlled. But inside something shifted. I can't marry you," she said, her voice gaining strength, her eyes fixed on Blackwell. "I'm sorry." The silence was deafening. Then the whispers started, like a swarm of bees buzzing with speculation, with gossip, with judgment. I need more than just promises," Sophia continued, her voice now clear, her gaze unwavering. "I can't settle for second best." She turned towards Blackwell, her smile radiant, her eyes shining with ambition. "Elliot," she said, her voice ringing with confidence, "I choose you." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, exclamations of shock and disbelief. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment, the betrayal, the shift in power. I stood there, my smile frozen on my face, my eyes cold, hard. I didn't react. Not yet. I was Damian Carter. And I didn't lose. But inside, something snapped. A cold, calculating rage ignited, a fury that would consume everything. Sophia, blinded by her ambition, by her misguided belief in Blackwell's power, had made a fatal mistake. She had underestimated me, she had betrayed me, and she would pay. The engagement party was over, the celebration ruined, but the game had just begun. The fallout was predictable. The ballroom, moments ago buzzing with polite conversation, was now a chaotic swirl of whispers and speculation. Cameras flashed, reporters shoved microphones in faces, and the vultures of social media descended in a feeding frenzy. Billionaire dumped at own engagement party screamed the headlines. My phone buzzed incessantly with alerts, each one a new variation on the same theme. Betrayal, humiliation, schadenfreude. The world, it seemed, was having a field day at my expense. I, however, remained unfazed. Or at least I projected an image of being unfazed. Years at the top had taught me the value of a poker face. Emotions were a weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited. And I, Damian Carter, did not show weakness. I excused myself from the gawking crowd, a curt nod to my father, a dismissive glance at the happy couple. Let them have their moment, their 15 minutes of fame. I had bigger things to worry about. As I made my way through the throng of stunned guests, I could feel their eyes on me. Pity, curiosity, a hint of fear? Good, let them fear. Fear was a powerful motivator. I slipped out a side door, leaving the chaos behind. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. I took a deep breath, savoring the silence, the solitude. This was my element. The calm before the storm. My phone buzzed again. Marco. The internet is exploding, he reported, his voice a mixture of awe and concern. This is bigger than we anticipated. Let it burn, I said, my voice cold, hard. It's a distraction, a sideshow. We have other matters to attend to. Marco, ever the pragmatist, didn't question my orders. Understood, he said. I'll start damage control. Damage control. A laughable concept. There was no controlling this. This was a wildfire, and I intended to let it consume everything in its path. Meanwhile, Elliot Blackwell was experiencing a different kind of fallout. His initial euphoria, the thrill of Sophia's public declaration, had quickly evaporated. He'd realized too late the magnitude of his mistake. His phone was ringing off the hook. Investors, partners, clients, all demanding answers, all expressing concerns. His carefully constructed image of the rising star, the next big thing in venture capital, was crumbling before his eyes. He'd tried to reach me, of course. Desperate voicemails, frantic texts, pleading emails. I ignored them all. He was a pawn, a tool, and now a liability. I had no use for him. I could picture him now, sweating, panicking, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. Good. Let him suffer. Let him experience the consequences of his miscalculation. He'd thought he was playing me. He'd thought he could use Sophia to gain access to my world, my money, my power. He'd been wrong. Dead wrong. And now he would pay the price. I smiled, a slow, predatory smile that had nothing to do with amusement. This was just the beginning, the opening act, the first move in a game that I would win. The morning after the engagement party was a symphony of chaos for Elliot Blackwell. His penthouse apartment, usually a sanctuary of sleek minimalism, was now a war zone of ringing phones, unanswered emails, and a mounting sense of dread. His investors, the ones who had flocked to him like moths to a flame, were now scattering like cockroaches exposed to the light. Elliot, what the hell happened? They demanded, their voices laced with panic. We need answers. We need reassurance. Reassurance was something Elliot couldn't offer. He was drowning, his carefully constructed facade of success crumbling around him like a poorly built sandcastle. He'd bet everything on me, on my investment, on my approval. And now he had nothing. The calls kept coming. Bankers, lawyers, partners all demanding explanations, all threatening consequences. His carefully curated world, built on a foundation of borrowed money and empty promises, was imploding. He tried to reach Sophia, to understand what had happened, to salvage something from the wreckage. But she wasn't answering his calls. She was probably holed up in her penthouse, surrounded by lawyers and PR consultants, trying to spin the narrative, to salvage her own reputation. He was alone, abandoned, exposed. In a desperate act of desperation, he decided to confront me. He showed up at my office, uninvited, unannounced, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot. My secretary, bless her efficient soul, tried to stop him, but Elliot was nothing if not persistent. He pushed past her, his voice a desperate plea. "Damien, I need to see you. It's urgent." I allowed him in, of course. It was amusing to watch him squirm. He stood before me, his expensive suit rumpled, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his composure shattered. "Damien," he began, his voice trembling, I can explain." "Explain what, Elliot?" I asked, my voice calm, measured, my gaze fixed on the cityscape beyond my window. I didn't need to look at him to know he was sweating, to feel the desperation radiating from him. "About Sophia," he stammered. "It was a misunderstanding. I never meant for any of that to happen. She's an idiot. She misunderstood my intentions. I didn't." "You didn't what, Elliot?" I interrupted, my voice still calm but with an underlying edge of steel. "You didn't anticipate her affection? Her greed?" Elliot flinched. He knew. He knew that he'd been screwed, that Sophia had overestimated him, just as he had tried to use her. He was a pawn in a game he didn't want to play, a victim of his own arrogance. "Damien," he pleaded, his voice cracking, I need your help. I need another chance." I turned to face him, my eyes cold, hard. "Another chance, Elliot?" I asked, my voice laced with disdain. "You thought you could use me, use Sophia to climb the ladder. You thought you could play in my world, by my rules, and now you beg for another chance?" Elliot's face crumpled. He knew that it was over, that he had lost, that he had destroyed himself. "You're finished, Elliot," I said, my voice flat, emotionless. "You're nothing." Elliot's shoulders slumped. He looked defeated, broken, and in that moment I felt a flicker of something. Not pity, not remorse, but satisfaction. He had tried to take something from me. He had tried to humiliate me, and now he was paying the price. I dismissed him with a wave of my hand. "Get out," I said, my voice cold, dismissive. "And don't ever come back." Elliot stumbled out of my office, a broken man, a shadow of his former self. And I turned back to the window, my gaze fixed on the cityscape, my mind already on the next move, the next conquest. The game was on, and I was just getting started. Taking down Elliot Blackwell's company wasn't about brute force. It was about precision. A surgeon's scalpel, not a butcher's cleaver. I didn't want to just destroy him. I wanted to dismantle him piece by piece, to let him feel the slow, agonizing burn of failure. The first move was financial. A few discreet calls to my contacts in the banking sector. Suddenly, Blackwell's lines of credit were restricted. Loans were called in. Interest rates mysteriously increased. The financial pressure already mounting became unbearable. Next, the whispers, not the crude, obvious kind, but subtle insinuations planted in the right ears, at the right cocktail parties, in the hushed tones of boardrooms. Blackwell's overextended. I'd let slip to a prominent investor. Heard he's leveraged to the hilt. Or, to a rival VC, Blackwell's lost Carter's backing. Wonder how long he can keep the lights on. The rumors spread like a virus, infecting the minds of those who had once flocked to Blackwell's banner. Doubt crept in. Confidence wavered, and the vultures, sensing weakness, began to circle. Then came the public pressure. A carefully orchestrated leak to the financial press about Blackwell's questionable investment strategies, his over-reliance on high-risk ventures, his lack of discipline. The articles were subtle, nuanced, but the message was clear. Blackwell was a risky bet, a house of cards waiting to collapse. The stock price of Blackwell's flagship company, already shaky, began to plummet. Investors, spooked by the rumors and the negative press, started dumping their shares. The downward spiral accelerated, a vortex of panic sucking Blackwell's empire into oblivion. I watched it all unfold from my office, a panoramic view of the city spread before me like a chessboard. Each move, each maneuver, was calculated, precise, designed to achieve maximum impact. I was playing a game, a high-stakes game with real-world consequences, and I was mastering it. The final blow was the hostile takeover bid. I didn't even need to use my own company. A shell corporation, a faceless entity with deep pockets and a singular purpose. The offer was generous on the surface, but the terms were predatory. Blackwell, desperate and drowning, had no choice but to accept. The news of the takeover sent shockwaves through the financial world. Blackwell, the once rising star, the darling of the VC scene, was being swallowed whole. His empire, his legacy, his everything was about to be mine. The takeover was swift, efficient, brutal. Blackwell's board, their loyalty long since eroded by the whispers and the financial pressure, offered little resistance. The shareholders, eager to salvage what they could, voted overwhelmingly in favor of the deal. Within days, it was done. Blackwell's company was mine. His assets, his clients, his power absorbed into my own empire. He was left with nothing. A shell of a man, stripped of his wealth, his status, his pride. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The victory was self-evident. The message was clear. You don't cross Damien Carter. You don't betray Damien Carter. And you certainly don't try to use Damien Carter. The takeover was more than just a business transaction. It was a statement, a demonstration of my power, my reach, my ruthlessness. It was a message to anyone who dared to challenge me, to anyone who dared to underestimate me. I was Damien Carter. And I always won. The world was spinning. Or maybe it was just Elliot. He wasn't sure anymore. One minute he was Elliot Blackwell, the golden boy of venture capital. The next, he was nothing. Less than nothing. He was a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones at exclusive clubs, a punchline delivered with a sneer. His phone, once a lifeline, was now a harbinger of doom. Each call, each text, each email brought fresh waves of bad news. Investors were pulling out, demanding their money back. Partners were severing ties, distancing themselves from the radioactive glow of his failure. Lawyers were circling, smelling blood, preparing lawsuits. His penthouse apartment, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage. He paced the rooms, his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows a stranger. A gaunt, desperate man with haunted eyes. He'd built his empire on borrowed time, borrowed money, borrowed everything. And now the bill was coming due. He tried to call Sophia, to understand what had happened, to salvage some semblance of something. But her number was disconnected. She'd vanished, likely into the protective embrace of lawyers and PR gurus, crafting her narrative, distancing herself from the wreckage he'd become. He thought of Damien, the cold, calculating gaze, the dismissive wave of his hand. He'd underestimated him. He'd thought he could play him, use him, climb the ladder on his back. He'd been so wrong. The hostile takeover was a masterstroke, a surgical strike that had cut him off at the knees. One minute he was Elliot Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Ventures. The next he was unemployed, bankrupt, a nobody. His carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of borrowed money and empty promises, had crumbled. His reputation, his credibility, his everything was gone. He tried to go to his usual haunts, the exclusive clubs, the power lunches, the networking events where he'd once been the center of attention. But the doors were closed to him. He was persona non grata, a pariah, a joke. The whispers followed him everywhere. Blackwell, they'd murmur, their voices laced with pity and disdain. Remember him? Used to be something, didn't he? He was a ghost, haunting the spaces he'd once ruled. invisible to the power brokers, the deal makers, the winners. He'd lost everything. His company, his money, his reputation, his dignity. He was a shell of a man, adrift in a sea of his own making. And the worst part? He knew he deserved it. He'd been arrogant, greedy, foolish. He'd thought he could play with the big boys, that he could outsmart Damian Carter. He'd been so wrong. Damian hadn't just taken his company. He'd taken everything. His past, his present, his future. He'd reduced him to nothing. And as Elliot sat alone in his empty apartment, the silence broken only by the echo of his own despair, he knew it was over. He was finished. Damian Carter had won. And he had lost, completely, utterly, irrevocably. Sophia watched Elliot's downfall with a growing sense of unease. It wasn't schadenfreude, not exactly. It was more a sinking feeling, a pit in her stomach that grew heavier with each news report, each whispered rumor, each failure. She'd thought she'd been clever, trading up, as she'd so boldly declared at the engagement party. She'd seen Elliot's tailored suits, his confident smile, his carefully cultivated air of success. She'd mistaken the trappings of power for power itself, and she'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Elliot's collapse was swift, brutal. One minute he was the rising star, the next he was nothing. His company, his money, his influence gone. Poof, just like that. She'd tried to reach him, of course. After the initial shock of the broken engagement wore off, she'd realized she needed to talk, to understand, to salvage something. But he was unreachable. His phone went straight to voicemail. His assistants were suddenly unavailable. His social media presence vanished. She'd seen him once, from a distance, at a trendy restaurant they used to frequent. He was alone, hunched over a drink, his face pale, his eyes defeated. He looked small, insignificant, nothing like the powerful man she'd thought he was. And then it hit her. The realization, cold and sharp, that she'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. It wasn't Elliot's power she'd been drawn to. It was the illusion of power, the reflection of Damian's influence. She'd thought she was choosing the stronger horse, the better bet, but she'd backed the wrong one. She'd mistaken a mirage for reality. Damian, he'd been different, always in control, calm, collected, powerful. He'd never needed to prove his worth. He just was. She'd thought he was predictable, reliable, safe. She'd thought she could manipulate him. She'd been so wrong. He'd let her go. He'd let her walk away. He hadn't pleaded. He hadn't begged. He hadn't even reacted. He'd simply let her go. And that, she realized now, was the most terrifying thing of all. He hadn't needed her. He hadn't even wanted her. She'd been a convenience, an accessory, and he'd discarded her without a second thought. She'd thought she was trading up, but she'd traded down. Way down. She'd traded a king for a knave, and now she was left with nothing. She'd misjudged everything. She'd misread the signs, miscalculated the risks, misidentified the true source of power. And now she was paying the price. She'd thought she was choosing a better future, but she'd chosen nothingness. And as she watched Elliot's downfall, she knew her own was just beginning. The charity gala was a who's who of New York's elite, the kind of event where fortunes were pledged and reputations were solidified. And tonight, Sophia Langley was an uninvited guest. She'd spent weeks trying to get to me. Calls to my office, messages through mutual acquaintances, even a pathetically handwritten note slipped to my secretary. All ignored, of course. I wasn't interested in explanations, apologies, or second chances. But Sophia, bless her persistence, had found another way in. A donation, a hefty one, to the charity I was sponsoring. It bought her a ticket, a chance to corner me, to plead her case. I almost admired her audacity. Almost. I spotted her the moment she entered the ballroom. She was a vision in red, a desperate attempt to recapture the spotlight, to reclaim the attention she'd so carelessly thrown away. But tonight, the spotlight wasn't on her. It was on me. She approached me as I was speaking with a group of investors, her smile hesitant, her eyes pleading. "Damian, she began, her voice barely a whisper. Can we talk? I turned to her, my expression carefully neutral, my smile thin. Sophia, I acknowledged, my voice cool, polite. How unexpected. The investors, sensing the drama, discreetly melted away. I was left alone with Sophia, the silence between us thick with history. Damien, she began again, her voice trembling slightly. I need to apologize. Apologize? I echoed, raising an eyebrow. For what, exactly? For everything, she said, her voice barely audible. For the engagement party. For Elliot. For everything. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, savoring her discomfort. And what makes you think an apology is sufficient? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. I made a mistake, she said, her eyes filling with tears. I was confused. I misjudged. Misjudged? I interrupted, my voice hardening. You misjudged me? You misjudged Elliot? Or did you simply misjudge your own worth? Her tears spilled over, her carefully applied makeup streaking down her cheeks. Damien, please, she begged, her voice cracking. I was wrong. I need you. Need me? I scoffed, my voice laced with disdain. You need me now that Elliot is nothing? Now that you've realized your mistake? She nodded, her sobs shaking her entire body. I was foolish, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I threw away the best thing I ever had. I watched her, my expression unchanging. I felt nothing. No pity, no remorse, no satisfaction. Just emptiness. She'd made her choice. She'd chosen ambition over loyalty, greed over love. And now she was paying the price. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen a few times, then held it up for her to see. On the screen, a video played. Security footage from the engagement party. The moment she'd called off our engagement. The moment she'd declared her love for Elliot. She watched the video, her eyes wide with horror, her face pale with shame. The memory of that night, the humiliation, the betrayal came flooding back. She stammered, her voice choked with sobs. I cut her off with a wave of my hand. No need for explanations, Sophia, I said, my voice cold, dismissive. Your actions speak for themselves. I turned away from her, my gaze sweeping across the ballroom, settling on a group of investors deep in conversation. Excuse me, Sophia, I said, my voice regaining its usual smoothness. I have more important matters to attend to. I walked away, leaving her standing there alone, humiliated, defeated. The whispers followed me, of course. But I didn't care. I'd made my point. I'd delivered my message. Sophia Langley had made a mistake. A fatal mistake. And now she was paying the price. The rejection was complete, utter, irrevocable. And as I moved through the crowd, my head held high, my smile confident, I knew I had won. Again. The annual Metropolitan Museum of Art Costume Institute Gala. A swirling vortex of art, fashion, and power. The air crackled with anticipation. The red carpet shimmered under the flashing lights, and the whispers of the assembled elite echoed through the grand hall. Tonight, I was making a statement. I arrived fashionably late, of course. Timing was everything, and I wasn't alone. Beside me, a vision in shimmering silver, was Isabella Rossi, my fiancée, or as the tabloids had dubbed her, the woman who finally tamed Damien Carter. Isabella was different. Not like Sophia, with her carefully calculated ambition and her hunger for the spotlight. Isabella was already in the spotlight, a force of nature in her own right. CEO of Rossi Designs, a global fashion empire built on her talent, her vision, and her ruthlessness. We'd met at a business summit in Davos, not over champagne and canapes, but over a heated debate about sustainable manufacturing practices. She'd challenged me, questioned my assumptions, and intrigued me. Our connection had been unexpected. A meeting of minds, a shared understanding of the cutthroat world of business, a mutual respect for power and ambition. There was no pretense, no games, no hidden agendas, just authenticity. And a spark. We'd kept our relationship out of the public eye, a deliberate move on both our parts. We were too busy building our empires to indulge in the trivialities of celebrity gossip. But tonight was different. Tonight was a declaration. As we walked the red carpet, the cameras flashed, the reporters shouted questions, the whispers intensified. Damien? Isabella, how did you two meet? Isabella, what's it like to be engaged to Damien Carter? Damien, any comment on Sophia Langley's recent difficulties? I simply smiled, a confident, self-assured smile that said everything. Isabella, ever poised, simply laughed and squeezed my arm. We were a team, a power couple, a force. Inside the gala, the atmosphere was electric. The room was packed with the movers and shakers of the world's CEOs, politicians, artists, philanthropists. They gravitated towards us, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had drawn me to Isabella. We were the center of attention, the ones to watch, the ones to impress. I worked the room, introducing Isabella to my contacts, my allies, my network. She was a natural, charming them with her wit, her intelligence, her presence. She was more than just a beautiful woman on my arm. She was my equal, my partner, my future. And then I saw her, Sophia. She was standing on the sidelines, near a group of lesser lights. She was dressed in a simple black dress, a stark contrast to the vibrant colors and elaborate designs that surrounded her. She looked small, insignificant, forgotten. She watched me, her eyes haunted. I could see the regret in them, the realization of what she'd lost, the understanding that she'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. I didn't acknowledge her. I didn't even glance her way. She was no longer relevant, no longer important. She was invisible. I continued my conversation with a prominent art collector, discussing the merits of a recently acquired piece, my voice smooth, my demeanor unfazed. I could feel Sophia's gaze on me, her presence a faint hum in the background, but I didn't react. Isabella, sensing the shift in my attention, subtly touched my arm. "Darling," she murmured, her voice warm, "that new acquisition of yours is simply breathtaking." I turned to her, my smile genuine. "Indeed," I agreed, my gaze lingering on her, my hand gently covering hers. "Just like you." She laughed, a soft, melodic sound that drew the attention of those around us. We were a picture of power, of success, of love. And Sophia, she was just a spectator, a ghost from my past, a reminder of what I had overcome. The gala was a triumph, a celebration of my success, my power, my future. And as I stood there with Isabella by my side, I knew I had won. Completely, utterly, irrevocably. The after-party was in full swing. A penthouse suite overlooking Central Park, the city lights twinkling like a million fallen stars. Music pulsed through the room, a mix of classic jazz and modern electronica, the perfect soundtrack for the celebration of my latest triumph. The takeover of Blackwell Ventures had been finalized that afternoon, the final nail in Elliot's coffin. Isabella, radiant in a crimson gown that screamed power and sophistication, was by my side, her hand resting lightly on my arm. We were the undisputed king and queen of this world, our every move watched, our every word dissected, our every gesture imitated. "You were magnificent today, darling," Isabella murmured, her voice a husky whisper against my ear. Ruthless, efficient, utterly captivating. I smiled, a genuine smile this time, the kind that reached my eyes. "Thank you, my love," I replied, my voice low, intimate. But the day isn't over yet. I excused myself, leaving Isabella to charm a group of influential senators, their wives hanging on her every word. I had one last piece of business to attend to, a final act in this performance. I spotted Sophia across the room, standing alone near a window, her gaze fixed on the cityscape below. She looked lost, a solitary figure in a sea of celebration, a stark reminder of the consequences of misjudgment. I approached her, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence. She was too absorbed in her own thoughts, her own regrets. "Sophia," I said, my voice soft, almost gentle. She flinched as if startled and slowly turned to face me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her makeup smudged, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "Damien," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, watching her, letting the silence hang heavy between us. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all faded away, leaving only the two of us, suspended in this moment. She stammered, her voice choked with emotion. I raised a hand, silencing her. "No need for words, Sophia," I said, my voice calm, measured. "I think we both understand the situation." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I made a mistake," she whispered, her voice breaking. "A terrible mistake." "Indeed," I agreed, my voice devoid of emotion. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, her expression desperate. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head. "No, Sophia," I said, my voice firm, final. "There's nothing. You made your choice, and now you have to live with the consequences." She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. I understand," she said, her voice barely audible. I nodded. "Good," I said. "Then I'll leave you to it." I turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Sophia," I said, my voice laced with a hint of amusement. "Give my regards to Elliot." I walked away, leaving her standing there, alone, defeated, a ghost in her own life. The image of her, broken and lost, would stay with me, a reminder of the cost of betrayal. Meanwhile, across town, in a dimly lit bar, Elliot Blackwell was drowning his sorrows. The once crowded space was now deserted, the only company the bartender, who watched him with a mixture of pity and disdain. Elliot, his expensive suit rumpled, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled, looked defeated. He raised his glass, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim, and took a long, desperate gulp. "Another one, Mr. Blackwell?" the bartender asked, his voice flat, emotionless. Elliot nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty stool beside him. He'd been there for hours, nursing his drink, replaying the events of the past few weeks in his mind. The engagement party, the hostile takeover, the collapse of his world. He'd lost everything. His company, his money, his reputation, his future. He was a nobody, a has-been, a joke. He thought of Sophia, her betrayal, her ambition. He'd been a fool to trust her, a fool to think he could use her to get to Damien. He'd been outplayed, outmaneuvered, out everything. Damien Carter had destroyed him, completely, utterly, irrevocably. He raised his glass again, the liquor burning its way down his throat. "To Damien Carter," he muttered, his voice slurred, his eyes filled with hate. "May he rot in hell." The bartender didn't respond. He just watched Elliot, his expression unchanging. He'd seen it all before, the rise and fall of empires, the triumph of the strong over the weak, the inevitability of it all. Elliot finished his drink, the glass clattering onto the bar. He stood up, his legs unsteady, his vision blurred. He stumbled out of the bar, into the cold night air, his future as uncertain as the shadows that danced around him. Back at the gala, I stood on the balcony, overlooking the city lights, Isabella by my side. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all faded away as I watched Sophia leave, her shoulders slumped, her footsteps heavy. She paused at the entrance, her gaze sweeping across the room, searching for something, or someone. Her eyes met mine, and for a fleeting moment I saw a flicker of regret, of longing, of loss. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I watched her go, my expression unchanging, my heart unmoved. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. I turned to Isabella, my smile genuine, my eyes filled with gratitude. She was everything Sophia wasn't. Strong, intelligent, loyal, a true partner, a worthy queen. "Ready to go, darling?" she asked, her voice soft, her hand gently touching my arm. I nodded. "Yes," I said, my voice firm, confident. "Let's go." We left the gala, hand in hand, our footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. The future stretched before us, bright, limitless, full of possibility. And as we stepped out into the night, the city lights reflecting in our eyes, I knew I had won, completely, utterly, irrevocably.